I thought we would address the topic and go through the very nature of the subject and see what validity, if any, it has. So, how are you doing today, Alva?
I'm well, thank you very much. Let's hope it's not completely sweeping across the world, or maybe we wish it was in a way, considering the people that are reproducing these days. But I've mainly seen it in the vegan community or in the atheist community that there's a lot of people springing up talking about this, so I definitely think it's something worth exploring and kind of diving into and dissecting. Basically what anti-natalism is the standpoint or philosophical position that reproducing is a bad thing to do, hence the word anti-natalism. And the anti-natalists usually hold this position for different reasons. You have the people who just simply don't want to have children. You have the people who dislike children. You have the people who talk about overpopulation. And then you have the people who believe this is morally superior and that bringing a sentient being into the world will inevitably cause suffering and is therefore a bad thing to do. And a popular argument that people often bring up comes from David Bitnar, who has at least a couple of books on antinatalism, and the argument is the presence of pain is bad, the presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone. The absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is deprivation. In other words, saying, since being in this world, there's a possibility for you to suffer, that's a bad thing, and if you were never born, you wouldn't be able to have that experience on this earth, so therefore it's better to never have been born. And what are your opinions on that, Michael?
Well, the argument is really suspicious. Pretty much every premise in it has an issue with it. One of the first issues that might come to somebody's mind when they think about such an argument is the idea that there can be good without people. This is sort of like the notion that there could be a number without matter or energy or consciousness or anything, that there could be a number on its own. And this is certainly not a majority position in philosophy. It's not a well-accepted position that you could have a good that exists with nothing there. I assume the person is not like a theist of some type, and they're not saying that it's only God's good with nothing to pervert it or impurify it. So this particular individual is saying that there's just this good that is floating around out there without connection to actions or to some sort of utilitarian values or to UPB or Kantianism or anything. It's just out there somehow, and it goes up in some kind of a meter or something, in some sort of a thermometer type thing, when there are less people, or when there's less suffering, or when there's less pain. And that's pretty damn bizarre if you think about it, like trying to imagine why in the world this could possibly be. But the more difficult and almost certainly incorrect, or at least almost certainly not in any way provably correct statement within the argument is that pain is bad, essentially. Now, the syllogism, of course, just to point it out, is completely valid. It's a valid syllogism. Everything in it, as far as the logic, is fine. But we're addressing the premises and seeing whether or not they hold up. So, the idea that pain is bad is kind of strange, to say the least. We might turn our minds to masochism, or to BDSM, or S&M, or to the similarities between pain and pleasure, and think to ourselves, well, what does this mean? I mean, how can something that is experienced as positive or negative differently between individuals necessarily always be bad? Does that really make sense? Additionally, pain really, according to science, is a biological phenomena, meaning that pain, as in the effects of a noxious stimuli, can be felt or at least occur even in nerve tissue that is not connected to a brain, that is not experienced as far as we know. Pain is something which is just a reaction that has evolved over time. The experience of pain is just a perception which varies insofar as how one would relate it to oneself. And it is a pretty strange idea to hang the whole fate of the universe and the fabric of morality on this arbitrary biological function. So, for example, let's say that we could prove or demonstrate that some particular type of art was pleasing to people or aesthetically beautiful. Would it be a wise idea to basically hang every bit of morality, essentially, which is what the syllogism would touch on if it were true, upon this particular type of art? It doesn't seem to me that that would be a wise idea philosophically. So how on earth do we know that pain is bad, and how do we even know that pleasure is always good? It's a strange thing, and why should biological processes be given this much weight as far as their importance?
Good point there, Michael. While I agree with you, I tend to lean towards that suffering isn't the best and what most people probably would like to avoid. But that being said, we can't really measure if people experience more pleasure or more suffering in this world. And saying that if you experience any suffering at all, then you shouldn't be alive. That to me just simplifies things to a point where they just lose all meaning. And so I don't like that argument either that you hear a lot of modern antinatalists say, like, if there's any chance of suffering at all, that's the problem. And most human beings, or at least a lot of human beings, will say that they want to stay alive. They're even glad to be alive. They definitely don't want to kill themselves. And they look forward to things in the future, and a lot of them enjoy their days. And so, how can that be when people suffer and when we see kids living in, like, straight up, like, shitholes pretty much, or war zones, or people being born with all sorts of deformities, and yet sometimes these people are the happiest people you'll ever find? It doesn't really make much sense, does it? That is what we see, so it's hard to just sit there and say that from our idea of what causes suffering and pain, that that's somehow this horrible thing, you know? Not that I'm pro-war or anything like that, but the human being is very adaptable, and it's known as hedonic adaptation, which is the tendency for humans to return to a level of happiness fairly quickly if they've had bad experiences, and kind of stay throughout their life consistently, if not happy, then content. We adapt to things and we grow and we learn as human beings. And so I can only say for me that I'm one of those people who, even though some days don't feel that great and I feel very depressed, and I have had years where I have been very depressed, I think that's where antinatalism comes from. It comes from an unhealthy and depressed mind. It doesn't come from the normal human psyche, if that makes any sense. It comes from someone doing so much thinking about negative things that you're caught up in this cycle. And that is what makes antinatalism attractive to you as a philosophical standpoint, and it starts making sense to you when you're in that depressed state. I'm not saying that every antinatalist out there is depressed, but to me, when I feel very depressed, that's when these views start, like, making sense. But when I'm thinking more clearly, they don't make any sense at all.
Definitely. And we're not saying that antinatalism is wrong or incorrect simply because it often seems to appear in people who have some sort of an emotional disturbance, but this is, of course, evidence that it might not come from a particularly valid position. So if somebody were to show up at a business meeting wearing scuba gear and a tutu, we might be able to say that coming from whatever position that might be, that the business meeting might not be going so well. A lot of people bring up an argument from consent in relationship to antinatalism. So do you want to elucidate that particular argument?
Yes, Michael, you're completely right. A very common argument from antinatalists is that when you bring in a new life into this world, that person has not had the chance to consent into being brought to life, and therefore it is unethical to do so.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting argument. Both of us being beyond left-right libertarians, we would automatically think of it as perhaps valid, but upon closer inspection, there are some serious problems with it. So to begin with, there's an idea that is easy to grasp, and it's present in different areas of what one might call the softer sciences, as well as general personal understanding of the world, and this is the idea of assumed consent. So if we've been married to someone for years and years and years, and we want to fuck them, and they don't put up any kind of resistance or show the slightest sign that they don't want to get fucked, then we might assume that to do so without directly asking is not rape. On the other side of things, we might imagine handing out $1,000,000 bills. Now, I don't even know if such a thing exists, probably does. I'm not an expert at Federal Reserve debt notes, but let's say they do. Let's say you shoved one into someone's hand without their consent. Well, is that really a violation of some kind of deep libertarian ethical principle? No, it's not. It's not a violation of it. Somebody might use it for ill, it might go wrong, it might end up producing some sort of bad outcome, but at the end of the day, most people, at least for a good amount of time within their life, would have chosen to get the bill. Most people having sex with their partner would have chosen it rather than to not have it when it is obvious that they wanted it. And similarly, when someone is given the chance to be born, to exist, even given an atheistic paradigm, this is like the golden ticket. This is the shining gateway to experienced eternity. This is amazing. It's unbelievable. You can have the utmost, the furthest, the best experiences that can even be imagined that, again, on even an atheistic view, you apparently wouldn't be able to have without being born. And so, granted that your birth and upbringing are in a reasonable context, this is nothing that somebody would have to consent to, because it's like being given millions of dollars. It's something that anybody with the potential to have these things would want. And it's only because antinatalists have a depressive view of the world that they would think that existence in the world and living a life is bad and that nobody ought to want it. It's part of their depressed ideology, but seeing how people want to live, how they're glad that they're alive most of the time, how they feel that their life has meaning, that they create meaning, that they can do things that will improve the world, that they can achieve goals, it really is like giving someone a golden ticket to the stars. It's something that is incredible. Furthermore, however, if we assume that agency begins at some particular point in a person's life, then at, say, week number 23 or something like that, I've got no idea as to the topic, but wherever consciousness would be said to begin on the antinatalist atheistic paradigm, that is when a person has the ability to consent or not to consent. If you're starting the discussion at that point, then you can say, well, does the person consent to this, or do they consent to that? But if you are starting it before then you have made a mistake, because if a lump of flesh doesn't have consciousness, it can't consent and can't not consent, and assuming nothing unconsenting is caused by the people creating the child after it has achieved sentience, or that they at least are not trying to cause such things, then nothing immoral has happened, because it is at the moment of existence which choice can begin. You couldn't, on such a paradigm, choose or not choose anything if you don't even exist. And so this argument is really not strong at all. You have the idea of assumed consent, you have the idea of when consciousness begins and where consent is placed along the process of beginning, and you also have a general notion of the fact that people usually are glad that they were born. And so putting all these factors together, the consent argument seems not to hold up very well. What's your opinion of the analysis? Alva.
Well, yeah, I think your arguments on consent really come from an objective view and taking a step back and really looking at it. And I tend to agree with you. What do you think, though, of the argument of overpopulation and that being a good reason not to bring any children into the world?
Overpopulation is a fascinating subject. It has been predicted for years and years and years. It's sort of like the second coming of Jesus Christ. Every single year, people predict that it will really raise its head and cause a massive problem, and it never seems to do so. Or at least in the case of the second coming of Christ, some people are happy about it, some aren't. But whatever the case may be, it doesn't really happen in truth. There is no such thing as overpopulation. If we overpopulate enough, we'll just die out and decrease back down. The number of people is not the problem, environmentally speaking. You could have a very small number of people, and they could get their hands on incredibly toxic chemicals and blow out the ozone layer, or completely blow up the earth, or still fill it full of garbage in a certain period of time, given a long enough period of time if they lived on it, even if the population were really, really tiny. So overpopulation isn't true. We can feed people easily with technology, like growing algae.
Yeah, there's already enough food out there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is even, like, for the future that I'm referring to. Today, we could grow enough general, organic, normal, non-GMO food to easily feed the world. And I encourage anyone to do a calculation for the calories that would be required. Just go and figure out how much arable land there is that you could grow, say, potatoes on, and figure it out for the 7 or 8 billion people, however many you think there are. And it really works. There'd be enough to feed, like, 20 billion people, in truth, if you used all the arable land. We wouldn't want to have to do that, because then you'd cut down forests to be able to produce enough arable land to take it all into account, but we're well before 20 billion people, and most of the land that would be used is open. The truth is that most of the food that gets produced goes to a bunch of nonsense, like biofuel, whatever the hell, that could easily be replaced by Tesla technology, and animal agriculture to an excessive degree, where people are living on meat when they could eat cheaper, more reasonable things. So, at the end of the day, overpopulation is not even based in anything, really. It's just this sort of thing that people hold on to like a religion. The world is massive, and most of it's not populated by people. All the people in the world could easily fit into Texas, for instance. The human population is higher than it would naturally be, but this isn't because people are reproducing too quickly for some arbitrary reason. This isn't because of some inevitable overpopulation doom. It's just because the ecosystem of the planet is disturbed, and so the guy in mind needs a bunch of people to figure out how to fix it, and so it's making certain things overproduce. It's like plagues. Just because there's something going on, and nature has to produce a bunch of entities that can manipulate it back into balance. So it's like a fever, it's like any kind of extreme, but it doesn't really affect anything in the long run except for humans in very crowded areas, and anti-natalism wouldn't affect it anyway, because the people who are overpopulated aren't white, Western anti-natalists who've gone to liberal arts universities.
I think that I don't give any value to humans being born in higher numbers or not. I don't think it is morally superior to not bring children into this world, and I don't think it's morally superior to bring children into this world. I think it is a personal decision. I definitely think it's more natural to bring children into this world, but it's not necessarily better or worse. And that's where I struggle with the whole anti-natalism view, because they're acting like they're somehow morally superior when it's not. If you think about it this way, the people who hold the view of anti-natalism are usually thinkers, a lot of them. They might not come to the same conclusions as we have, but they have thought about things. They care about suffering, they care about people living happy lives, and usually they care about animals and the environment a lot. And they're the type of people who would raise their children peacefully and be able to help create a world with less suffering that they desire. So here we go. These people that have these views then decide, oh, well, I'm not going to have children because the world is so bad, so let's not bring any more life into it. Yet the other human beings that don't think about these things, at least not deeply, and don't really worry about the other humans or the animals or the earth that we live on, are gonna keep reproducing. And they won't have the counterbalance of children being born into peaceful homes to help kind of balance kind of unconscious people reproducing, which will likely create more suffering into this world, wipe the thinkers and people are able to have a lot of empathy out of this world and leave people in that are more biologically oriented and just sheeple. That might sound negative, but you know what I mean.
Definitely very well said. And I think that one way to look at the antinatalism ideology as it relates to the continuance of itself is that it could be seen as sort of a mental virus or a mental parasite, because it will get wiped out eventually. Everybody who practices it or who could practice it will be removed from the gene pool if it becomes as popular as it could possibly be, and then people who are immune to it will remain. And so it's not something that is going to endure. This is a very clear and obvious principle of logic and of evolution and of replicators, and there's no serious way that anyone can get around it because it's the way that things work. But interestingly enough, the point that you made, I think, is very powerful, because not only is it something that is not practical, it's not something that is going to happen, it's something that will extinguish itself, but also in the process of doing so, we're going to end up with a lower quality of people, because what's going to be left over when you remove everyone from the gene pool who could possibly really deeply care about the future of their children? Well, the people left over are on average going to be way worse, and so you're selecting for that both culturally and biologically, and this is something that is really undesirable and will cause large problems, almost certainly. Whatever is the lot of mankind, I want to taste within my deepest self. I want to seize the highest and the lowest, to load its woe and bliss upon my breast, and thus expand my single self titanically, and in the end go down with it all the rest. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So there is a direction which antinatalism leads to, or a path that it comes from, and it's difficult to say which is which, but it is something which has a name which I can't even pronounce. I don't know how to say it properly, but I'll try to say it. Efilism or Efilism sounds like some kind of a sexually transmitted disease, but do you want to go into whatever it is and pronounce it properly for me so that we can talk about its nature? Because this is where you're going to go if you become an antinatalist, at least eventually if you follow it through to its logical conclusion.
Yes, Michael, so Efilism is definitely a very disturbing idea. What it is life spelled backward, and basically what it is the idea that all sentient life is meaningless and there's absolutely no value to it, and therefore the beneficial thing to do is to end all life. Doing so would end all suffering. And so that includes animals. I don't think it includes plants. Maybe it does, I don't know. It's still a young idea out there, but more people are starting to talk about it, and basically they hate nature and everything that is a part of creation, and they just really want to annihilate everything, I suppose, because they believe that would be the good and moral thing to do, which is very disturbing, especially at first glance. And they know it's disturbing at first glance, but they try to convince you to agree with them, and they tell you you will go through a few steps and eventually that will lead to Efilism. And that is usually eventually you'll be an atheist, then you'll learn more about evolution, and then you'll become an Efilism, which doesn't even make any sense. There's plenty of atheists that know about evolution and still think life is beautiful. Determinism is one of the main things that atheists talk about, which is silly on its own because atheism, for one, cannot be proven. Determinism cannot be proven. Evolution, yes, there's a lot of evidence for evolution, but it has nothing to do with atheism or determinism, so that gets thrown out the window. And even if you said that there was no purpose to life, or that everything is meaningless, then why would you mean to annihilate all life for the belief that that is something good? Because that would be without purpose.
Definitely excellently stated. A good way to think about it is that if there's no purpose in life at all, then Efilism or antinatalism, especially Efilism, can have no meaning or justification to it, and it's just a random series of events that are happening in someone's brain, and therefore it shouldn't affect any rational person who wants to further his or her own pleasure and power. And if there is meaning in the world, and it's only one meaning, which is to destroy all life or something, then that's pretty bizarre, and we'd have to have extraordinary evidence for such an extraordinary claim. And so both sides of the examination of the ideology show that it has massive holes, and the people who support it have these weird arguments for determinism that are so bizarre. I have trouble even believing that these people can really have the courage to post them on the internet. Do you want to read one of the arguments for determinism?
Yeah, I would be happy to do so, Michael. Why is an understanding of determinism important? It is important to understand that nothing you have done was really your choice. You did not choose your parents, where you were born, your early child education, or all of the external factors that caused your brain to adopt the personality you call your own. You could have been any of the other humans on Earth, and if you were, you would have been them. You could have been any of the animals as well. It is just luck of the draw that you're human and capable of reading this writing.
So this guy is obviously insane or has no understanding of philosophy of any kind, because under a normal model of atheism, your consciousness is a product of your brain and it cannot be separated from your brain, and so you couldn't potentially be all of these other things like animals and other people. And so the idea of using that as an argument is very weird and bizarre. I get the image of some kind of a brain like being transplanted into a dolphin or something in my mind for some reason. And this is the level that people operate at. It is far more irrational than even a strident, ordinary atheist. These individuals are clearly a few coconuts short of a cream pie, and unfortunately we all are going to probably have to deal with the results of this sort of viewpoint coming forward in the future as people become more and more discontented with their existences and take out the anger they feel on scapegoats. But nonetheless, of course, those who idolize and worship pleasure and suffering will always be stronger and smarter than these individuals and have the force of nature behind them. So we probably are never going to have to really seriously worry, but it's an important thing to look at, these topics. And one must always remember that even if something like antinatalism never becomes wildly popular all over the world, it still is going to disrupt people's existences and cause a bunch of nonsense to occur. And I think one point that is very critical to mention is the fact that antinatalism is unreal, meaning it won't happen. Even if somehow we wiped out the Earth, there are billions of other planets with life on them, and it will never, ever, ever work. The universe is far too full of life and lust for it to even conceivably work. So what it is, in reality, is a fantasy. It is an imaginary idea that will never occur. And when somebody tries to put it into practice, they are wasting their precious energy and life for this fiction, making it sort of a religious process. And what we have to really get to if we want to create a better world is not how can we do this thing that literally is never going to happen, that is one of the few impossibilities in the whole universe. We have to say, what can we do to produce the best world that we possibly can? And these are two totally different questions, and anti-natalism is not going to answer the correct question in a valid way. The other thing that we have to note is the fact that natalism is just as meaningless as anti-natalism. There's nothing that ought to compel people to have children unless they automatically or naturally want to. They shouldn't be forced or coerced into having children, and if they don't want to, that's fine as well. The human race will continue anyway, and all life throughout the universe will continue anyway, but what we have to look at is whether or not an ideology is valid and whether or not it will produce real fruitful results in reality. And I think that is the key thing to keep in mind as we go through the silvery doors of understanding.
Oh, definitely, Michael. I agree on so many levels, and you really phrase it so eloquently. I personally don't hold... Sure, I don't really want to see the human race die out, but I honestly don't really care. Like, I could care less if humans continue, even though I do think there's a lot of beauty in humanity, but I don't think it really matters in the scheme of things if humans stay on this planet or not. That being said, I definitely value life and the experience I have as a human being. And I would be emotionally invested in seeing all life end and nothing existing in the whole universe. To me, I can't understand how that would be a good thing. So I guess that's my point of view.
Very true, and stated with the greatest of nobility. I completely agree. Nobody in their right mind could see such a thing as good. Well, we're about out of time for this episode, but I hope you all have enjoyed it immensely, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Auf Wiedersehen to all.
Thank you for listening.